In this exercise we'll look at lost and found edges. You'll hear this expression quite often in watercolour, lost and found, and it refers to the type of edge that you create depending on how much water you're using, whether you're working onto wet paper or onto dry paper. So in this exercise I'll try to demonstrate how you achieve these different effects. Up in this corner I'll do wet on dry, which is usually the way in which we start out painting. And so the paper is dry, it's 300 gram rough Saunders Waterford paper, and I'll just do a simple point of interest here. I'll do a tree, and so I just need to get a nice consistency here of pigment, a mix of cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, and so this is wet paint onto dry paper. And if this is a Christmas tree, I just need to find a bit of rhythm here to create these branches. Pick up some more pigment. So you get nice sharp edges here, what are called found edges, because as soon as the wet pigment goes onto the paper, the paper really absorbs the pigment quickly, and that gives you a nice sharp edge. But what we want is sometimes to have soft edges, lost edges. So how do we achieve that? Well, the maximum way to do it is to work wet on wet. So I'll just mark here that the next one I'm going to do is wet on wet. So first of all we have to wet the paper with a brush like this. You could you could use a spray, but I just can make sure that this is wet all over with this brush. And then there's quite a sheen on that wet paper there, so I'm just watching that. What I can do here is mix up the same kind of mix of cadmium yellow pigment and ultramarine blue, and let's see what happens when I put this mixture, pretty much the same as I used before, on this wet paper. So immediately it starts to splurge out, doesn't it? And it feels like it's gone out of control. You can get a certain amount of control back by thickening the pigment, as you can see me doing here, but basically because it's gone into wet paper, it just has to spread. But it's a very nice effect if that's the effect you want. So it's like like you're seeing the object through a mist. And there's a temptation to keep working into it, and the condition will change because the paper starts to dry reasonably quickly, but you're still going to get soft edges because the paper has got quite a lot of moisture in it. So that is wet on wet Okay, the next one will be dry on wet. So in this one I shall once again wet the paper, wet this area here, and now I've got to get pigment on the brush, but without having too much water held in the brush. And I'm not going to use this lovely Escoda brush with its fine point, because what we do in the next two exercises is very harsh on the brush. So always keep some old brushes, cheaper brushes. I'll use this one here. And what I need to do is make sure that the brush is pretty dry, but it's still got pigment on it. So if I pick up too much water, I shall dab it off onto this piece of tissue here. So let's see, I'm going to pick up much thicker pigment this time. Much thicker. And that water is being absorbed as we speak. So this is pretty thick pigment here, but I still think I'll need to dab it off here. Let's see what happens if I put this in here. It doesn't spread out quite the same way, does it? Let's get a bit more of that. In fact, you can see that by using the side of the brush and keeping the pigment fairly dry, it's a different effect. I'll pick up some more pigment here, dab it off. So there's slightly more control of the edges. And if I pick up thicker pigment still, tab off here, I can counteract the fact that the paper is damp and get some of this thick pigment to sit where I put it, thereby creating a slightly more tonal variety. So that one there is dry into wet. The next one will be dry on dry. That's particularly harsh on the brush. So this is completely dry, this paper, and I'll, just to remind me, dry on dry. On this one, I probably just need a little bit of water on the brush in order to get it to pick this up. Now, it's pretty thick and creamy there. Now what I do is I dab that off. And let's see what happens. I've got pigment on the brush, but it's dry paper, and this is pretty dry. So that's what gives us these broken lines like this. So, found edges here, as we had found edges here, but in fact, because it's so broken up, you start to get lost edges as well, where you get some nice scumbled effects. So picking up the pigment here, dab it off here, and some nice effects here. Particularly the broken edge when you flatten the brush and drag it across the rough surface of the paper. So you can see wet on dry, lots of sharp edges. Wet on wet, very fuzzy, seen through quite a mist. Dry on wet, some edges, some lost edges. Dry on dry, lots of found edges, sharp edges, but also some lost edges from a different effect, which is the scumbled, dragged brushstroke. Really, we want to get a combination of those effects, and so on this last one here, what I'll do is it's called spot wet, and this is a combination. So this one is a combination of lost and found edges. Lost and found edges. And if I get this one wrong, I've always got another place down here to try and correct it. So good to have this in my hand here. I'm not going to use this to wet the paper. I just want to create spot wet bits and leave some dry bits. So let's see, I'll pick up a brush here. It's in clear water, and I'll just do some wet marks, random, and let's see what happens when I go in with my brush here. Okay, so there it's gone. It's found some water, and some places there's no water, so it just sits where I put it. And then if I do this, let's see what we get. Got a little water down here. Keep picking up. But you can see here there are some found edges and some lost edges, where it finds water still sitting on the surface. And you get, in this, I think you get such a nice combination of lost and found edges that it's more fascinating. So let's try that again. Well, this time I could do a little bit of a spray with a little spray bottle here. Just a little cloud, and so there's a fine mist there. I'll also put in some wet marks and then carry on into that with this. So there's no water down there. It's gone in quite nicely. Here, getting some nice effects. Just mix up some more pigment. Okay, so here we go. Some lost and found effects here. That's quite nice. It's a lost edge there. And so you get more random marks. We don't really want to control watercolour completely because it has too many lovely effects that it can give you if you let it do what it likes to do. And so you've got to watch that that you let some of the watercolour go out of your control. Anyway, those are two lost and found edges with spot watering. Dry on wet, dry on dry, wet on wet, wet on dry. Lost and found edges.